Okay, this is just a really quick presentation as you're moving forward in your research paper, which is your final written assignment. So I have given you guys a list of 40 topics and asked you to choose one and then to decide how you're going to answer that particular research question, and then move forward and writing a research paper really based around this claim, this argument that you're making in relation to the question. Okay, so the big questions that you need to ask yourself as you're getting started is, who is your target audience? And you understand this based on the issue itself. Who does it impact directly? Who is significantly influenced or impacted by the topic at hand? So think about that. And if you're writing a paper on video games and the youth, debating on whether or not video games promote violence in our youth, then your target audience is more than likely going to be both children, but more importantly, parents, since parents are the group of people who are monitoring the video games that their children are using. So you're speaking to parents, that's your target audience. So just consider this idea of what your topic is and who it directly influences, and go from there. So once you've done that, once you've established who your target audience is, then you need to think about what your audience most likely is already aware of when it comes to your topic. So think about what's already been said, or what's assumed, or what's in the conversation out there right now, because this information is not necessary for you to include or repeat in your argument, but it is important to understand where the conversation is currently so that you can join the conversation, and then of course take us in the direction of your claim. So where can you look to begin research on this topic? That's the last question to start with, is once you know what topic you want to work in, where do you need to go to start your research process? What types of questions should you be asking in relation to this topic to get started? Where is this kind of information housed? Is there an organization somewhere who really works with this specific topic? If not, is there a scholar in the field who's been writing about whatever your topic is currently? Go to these different ideas and start to think about your research and where you can start this search for source materials and information to support your argument as evidence. Then you got to consider, what is your overall goal? So again, what is the argument that you're making, and what do you hope to accomplish? For all of you, a really basic goal is to persuade your audience that the claim that you're making is valid. That's your really broad goal. But when you think about that, think about what is necessary in your argument. What do you need to do in your argument to persuade your audience that your claim is significant and valid? So you got to think a little bit about the big picture, what it is that you want to accomplish, and what are the specific ways to accomplish your goal. So you're going to have to narrow your focus. You want to make sure that you are taking this big picture topic and really breaking it down. And the way to do that is to start to think about some key terms that are really popular right now. So again, to go back to this video games idea, if you're really focusing on video games and violence and how it impacts our youth, then you might think, video games, you might think the popularity, you might start thinking about what video games are really popular, and to do that you may want to find some records that give you some statistics on the sales of video games and what video games are selling most often, how successful certain video games have been, reviews of video games, and then from there you might think about this cultural influence and the different types of people that are represented in video games, the different types of societies that are depicted in video games. Think about this cultural influence, how society impacts video games, and then of course how video games in turn impacts society. Then you want to think about design, and this goes back into cultural influence because a video game is so often designed based on an understanding or an interpretation of society. So people that create these video games are taking in mind this world that we live in and trying to include or incorporate pieces of real life into these video games. So think about the design of these video games and how they are really meant in a lot of cases to mimic reality. And then moving on to the other side of this is you want to think about specific gaming systems. We've come a long way from video games like Mario Kart or the original Mario Brothers when you sat with one single controller and played. Now we have the Wii where we have, we're doing bowling gestures or tennis gestures, and you've got your other stuff. You've got your let's see. My husband has a game that has that you put. It's a toy gun like thing that you put the Wii remote in. So there are these different types of gestures and gaming systems, and they've revolutionized over time. So we're doing more things. We're standing up. We're dancing. We're moving. We're bowling. We're doing all these different things. Whereas 10 years ago, we were just sitting down around a single console. And then, of course, just even to branch a little further into probably more specifically what you're going to be focusing in, violence. You're going to want to think about the way different scenes are depicted in video games and how much violence and who's this violence aimed at, who are the people who are subject to these acts of violence. Is it a bad guy in the video game? Who is this bad guy? Who embodies this bad guy character? You want to think about what type of violence is lethal violence? Is it comical, slapstick violence? Think about, how violence is depicted and who it's aimed at and who is then acting, who's doing these violence acts. And then, of course, technology. Video games are always going to bring about these ideas of technology because video games are advancing every day, and that's because technology is advancing every day. But as technology has continued to advance, there's always going to be this question of whether or not technology is making life easier, making us more advanced as a society, or is it completely isolating us from reality? So it's this idea of if we see violence in video games, is it possible that because we've become so saturated with technology, because we've become so reliant on technology, that we've gotten to a place where we can no longer differentiate between reality and video games? So this is just a really broad review, but you really want to take your video games topic or whatever topic you choose and really start to narrow down your focus. And to do that, the best way is to really break out these different ideas or different themes that are thriving with this overall topic and then go from there. So your research materials, keep in mind that you should be out there looking for the most recent information. A good rule of thumb is that you really should look for nothing that's older than 10 years. So for you guys, 2004, anything that was written before 2004 is really not relevant anymore. There are some exceptions. There are some fields that were really big in the 90s and they really touched on in the 90s and not as much in this century. And so you want to be really careful that you're pulling the most recent, most relevant information that you can, because I've asked you guys to pick topics from this list because these 40 topics are all really relevant today. They're still being debated, or they're happening in pop culture, or they're up for debate and conversations constantly. And so I want you to take those conversations that are happening right now in our society and apply relevant research. So be sure to look for the most recent information that you can find. So while you're doing that, you're going to want to be able to evaluate your sources. And this is really important because you need to know if your source is reliable. If your source isn't reliable, then your argument is going to crumble beneath these unreliable sources. So just some good ways to figure out if your sources are reliable. If you're looking specifically at the author, look at what his or her credentials are. Where did they go to school? What do they have degrees in? Where are they working? What organization are they working with? How are they linked to this particular topic? So in other words, what makes them an expert on this particular topic? And that information should be published if wherever you find this information, the author, especially if they're reliable, is going to have their credentials published in some way. So be looking for that. Now, a lot of you guys, and I think this is pretty normal in this day and time, pull the majority of your sources from websites, which is great. But just some things to keep in mind. If when you're pulling a website, if you're not sure if it's a reliable or unreliable source, here are just some helpful hints. A personal page or a blog is almost always unreliable. That stuff is written by people for personal reasons, and it's just difficult to know whether or not there is some bias in there. So you want to move away from personal pages and blogs because they are unreliable or tend to be unreliable in nature. Now, special interest sites, so your nonprofit sites, these are also unreliable because they're typically biased, just like the personal page or the blog can be. If it's a special interest site, if they have this one goal in mind, then they tend to be a little more biased than a government site that just gives you facts, or an organization that is really geared towards research. So professional sites, this is where your reliable sources are going. This is where they're going to come from. Now, the reliable sources are typically maintained by institutions or organizations. So, any of the edu sites, the .org sites, a lot of times these professional sites that are meant to convey facts or research, these are typically reliable because they're monitored by these institutions and these organizations who publish them, and the information maintains a relevancy because it is constantly monitored by these scholars in these various fields. The news and journalistic sites, well, it really depends on the reliability of the Chronicle. So if you're looking at the New York Times, maybe there may be some reliable sources there. If you're reading Time Magazine, reliable sources, it's a reliable source. Things like that. Huffington Post is no longer a reliable source. It used to be a really great author base writing really strong, solid articles, but now it's become really saturated with pop culture. And because of that, it's no longer a reliable source. So just look at whatever organization these sites are being published through, whatever news source, and whatever the Chronicle is. If it's a timely, reliable, highly regarded journalism or news site, then it'll more than likely be reliable. Commercial sites are almost always unreliable because these are your mostly your .coms, and they are really meant just to attract clients. So there is again some bias because their job is to convince you to believe what they're selling, and it's not always a very valid product. So just some things to keep in mind. And remember to research both sides. So once you've picked your topic and you've narrowed your focus and you've decided what your claim is and how you want to go about it, it's really important to consider the opposition. So you're going to want to research what the opposition is saying. You're going to want to look at what the current conversation is and join that conversation, which means establishing a common ground. So we talked a little bit about this when we were looking at the Rogerian arguments, but it's this idea of compromise. It's this idea of saying, yes, the opposition feels this way, and that's valid, however, and pointing out the flaws in the opposition's argument. So you want to identify the claim of the opposition and then refute that claim. So this is where we start to move away. In the solution papers, you were doing more Rogerian arguments, but the research paper is going to push away from that. Now, you definitely need to establish common ground just like you would in a Rogerian argument. But for the purpose of the research argumentative paper, once you've established what that claim of the opposition is, you're going to want to refute that claim. Make this big picture argument because that is what's more likely to persuade your audience. Okay, so that is just really briefly narrowing your research. As you're getting started, now that you've identified your topic, you're going to share some of these with your classmates in a discussion forum, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the way this process works in the coming weeks. And for now, that's it.